regard to the seniors housing market fundamentals, but also Florida. We'll also be covering some highlights of some potential trends, challenges, and opportunities in seniors housing in the coming years. How many of you are familiar with NIC? Oh, that's good. Good. For those of you who may not be familiar, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is to promote access and choice in seniors housing for America's elders. And we do this in a couple of ways, well, 3 ways in particular. One, through our 2 conferences that we hold every year in the fall and the spring that bring together capital seekers, capital providers, operators, developers, owners, all in one place to have meetings, network, cut deals, and learn about hot topics in the senior living industry. The second thing that we do is we are active in providing thought leadership through our publications and our presentations. And the third thing we do is the NIC map data service. And many of you may be familiar with NIC map. A lot of the data that I'm going to be showing you today is NIC map data. This is the coverage map for NIC map. And currently we are covering about 15,000 seniors housing and care properties in the United States in 114 metro markets. And this is where the markets are located. The main goal of NIC map is to promote transparency in the seniors housing and care sector in order to attract smart capital to the industry to further our mission of creating access and choice for America's elders. There's our agenda. I kind of tipped you off on what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to dive right into the national market trends. And this is going to be kind of a macro level view of the market fundamentals for primarily the top 31 markets in the United States that NIC map is tracking. That particular set of markets is the largest in the country. It's pretty representative of the nation, and it is one where we have the largest time series. Pretty much the entire business cycle, and it dates back to the end of 2005 is when we started collecting the data all the way to the second quarter. And I will be sharing with you some of the second quarter results that were just released last week. So I'm going to start off with kind of a semi-intimidating looking chart. This is the seniors housing market fundamentals in the primary markets for the time series. And as I mentioned, well, I haven't mentioned it yet, but I'm planning on mentioning that the seniors housing is comprised of 2 component parts: independent living, majority independent living properties, and majority assisted living properties. Majority independent living properties do also include the CCRC component, those units in CCRCs. However, CCRC is not specifically separated out of that majority property type. Now, assisted living, which is also a component of the seniors housing in aggregate, also is comprised of memory care units. Now, majority independent living properties can have assisted living and memory care units within them, but they are majority independent living, and likewise with the assisted living product type. But this is the aggregate. And what we see here is a few things. You see the entire time series, the business cycle. The inventory growth by quarter, the net inventory growth is represented by the blue bars. The net absorption is represented by the orange bars. The stabilized occupancy is represented by the gray line, and the all occupancy rate is represented by the green line. And that's the line that we're mostly going to be talking about today throughout this section. So just regard to the business cycle, I want to point out that we've got a full cycle here, and beginning in 2006 and sliding into the recession, we had high occupancy rates, but as the recession kind of picked up speed, occupancy rates began to fall as inventory growth picked up and absorption stalled because people just weren't moving into seniors housing like they had been in the past. For a number of reasons, the economy being one, the inability to sell their homes being two, general concern about the economy, people not wanting to move in, really kind of put the brakes on absorption and really caused occupancy rates to fall. And if you see in the 2008-2009 period, we've got a lot of inventory growth in seniors housing that spiked up then because there was a lot of building prior to the recession, and as the recession started, that stuff was in the pipeline and it had to come out of the ground. So unfortunately, as you can see, there's hardly any absorption in those orange bars. In fact, it went negative in 2009, which really kind of bottomed out the occupancy rate. Now, coming out of the recession, you can see that there was kind of moderate inventory growth and better absorption, which really allowed the occupancy rate to rise until we got up to about the end of 2014. At that point, it was kind of the top of the cycle, and seniors housing construction really took off. As you can see by the spikes in the blue bars, which is the net inventory growth. Unfortunately, for most quarters, absorption was not able to keep up. It was strong, but just not strong enough. And hence, the occupancy rates began to fall. And they fell even more dramatically or faster just in the past few years. So currently, we've got a situation where the all occupancy rate for seniors housing is 87.9%. 87.8% in the second quarter, which is the lowest rate that it's reached since 2011. Pretty low. So during the second quarter, which is the far left-hand side of the chart, the right-hand side for you guys, inventory grew by about 5,300 units for seniors housing just in that one quarter. So that was really strong inventory growth. It was pretty much the highest quarterly delivery on record. And demand was quite strong too, at about 3,400 units, but it obviously just wasn't strong enough. We had a good first quarter where for the first time in many years, absorption outpaced inventory growth, and there was some stabilization in occupancy rates, but unfortunately that trend didn't hold, and we've slid a little bit with regard to occupancy. I do want to point out here, when we're talking about seniors housing, does not include skilled nursing units. We're not talking about skilled nursing at all. They're not included here. But if you're interested in learning more about skilled nursing, I would want to direct you to the NIC website, where we have a free report that has some national figures on skilled nursing market fundamentals. This chart, I'm going to break out the market fundamentals by the two component parts, assisted living. This is looking at really highlighting that low occupancy rate, which is driven by assisted living primarily. Right now, assisted living as of the second quarter is at an all-time low occupancy rate of about 85.1%. We're considering the supply and demand metrics, looking at the orange and blue lines on the right-hand side of the chart. For all of 2018, net absorption reached the most in any year since 2006, so it's strong. And it registered the strongest quarter for net demand on record as well. So the first quarter this year was the first quarter since the end of 2015, where absorption exceeded supply growth, but just slightly. But inventory growth also hit a record high. We've seen a lot of inventory growth in the last few years. In 2018, making that gap between the net absorption and inventory growth a little bit less than 2017, but not tremendously. It's still very wide. The main takeaway I want you to take from this chart is looking at the wide difference between the stabilized occupancy rates and the all occupancy rates for assisted living. And that spread right now is about 3 percentage points. And it's pretty widespread, as you can see. And what that really signifies is the fact that there is just a lot of product still out there that is still in lease-up. It's going to take some time for that product to be absorbed, and the two occupancy rates, the stabilized and the all occupancy rate, reflect that fact. Independent living, this is a similar looking chart, but obviously, as you can see, inventory growth has not grown as much as with assisted living, as you can see by the blue bars, and absorption had kept pace with inventory growth for quite a few quarters, allowing those two occupancy rates to rise. Interestingly, independent living occupancy has been above 90% for many quarters, several years, and only recently has it started to take a tiny little bit of a dip, but it's still above 90%. The stabilized occupancy was only 1.4 percentage points above the all occupancy rate. And so this really just shows that the gap between the all and stabilized occupancy is relatively small compared to assisted living, and really reflects the fact that independent living development has been more muted than it has been in assisted living. Now, the reasons for the differences in occupancy performance can be traced to the distinct patterns that you see between inventory growth and absorption for both independent living and assisted living. The blue lines are signifying annual inventory growth year over year, and the orange lines are annual absorption. So overall, as you can see from the bottom chart, assisted living has been growing over a longer period of time than independent living. And coming out of the Great Recession, much of that new development was assisted living, as I mentioned before. And the reason for that is there was a general sentiment among investors that assisted living was potentially more recession-proof. It was potentially a less risky play, safer bet, and more needs-driven than independent living. So it became more attractive in the minds of investors, and hence development really shot up assisted living. Looking at the chart at the top for independent living, since early 2016, supply outpaced demand, but for assisted living, the supply and demand gap in the same period is much larger. But note that net absorption for assisted living has been steadily accelerating since 2017, but there's been a gradual decrease in inventory growth in the past quarter and past few quarters, and right now we're close to equilibrium for both independent living and assisted living with regard to supply and demand. However long that lasts, I'm not sure. We'll have to see how the trends play out, but right now, inventory growth's been strong, but absorption and demand's been strong as well. Another look at occupancy, a little more simplified look that's showing the pattern of occupancy rates. Really isolates the differences in the occupancy patterns. Green line is the all occupancy rate for seniors housing. Blue line is independent living, and that plunging orange line is assisted living. And what's most important to note here is that the spread, the difference in the all occupancy rate for assisted living and independent living is 5 percentage points right now. Again, assisted living at an all-time low, 85.1%. Independent living at 90.2%, and it's only fallen just 10 basis points from the prior quarter. Yes?
I think that's kind of what contributed. We had quite a big spread in 06, 07, and then as we hit the recession, that spread narrowed. Is that kind of why they determined that it was more recession-proof?
Yeah, there's some, there was greater absorption with regard to assisted living because it was more needs-based. And so pulling out of the recession, people needed to move in to seniors housing, and because independent living was more choice-based, lifestyle-based, people and home prices weren't great, people weren't selling their homes, they were waiting longer. And in some cases, they couldn't wait any longer than they moved to assisted living. Now, the situation we have in the country right now, and you all have been aware of this, is that ever since the recession, the age of entry in seniors housing has been growing. And some of that stemmed from people waiting a long time during the recession, and it's kind of been a habit of people waiting longer and longer. But right now, the average age of move-in is 83, 84, and that's true for independent living and assisted living. Assisted living So, you know, the situation in the country is we've got rising levels of acuity and independent living. You know, and there's a lot of blurring of the lines between independent living and assisted living, but with regard to the majority property types, independent living, which is still really lifestyle-based, is doing better than assisted living, primarily because of the supply and demand imbalances that we've seen with assisted living. And that does include memory care too. There's been a tremendous amount of new construction in memory care over the past few years, but recently that construction has fallen off quite a bit. And, you know, people are just really waiting for that supply to catch up, the demand to catch up with the supply. Just want to show you quickly how the secondary markets compare with the primary markets, and they're pretty similar. Ignoring the dotted lines, which are the stabilized occupancy rates, and just focusing on solid lines, the primary and secondary markets are pretty much in lockstep right now. That wasn't always the case. In fact, coming out of the recession, there was more construction and more development put into the primary markets, which put downward pressure on occupancy rates than in the secondary markets, but that's kind of changed as more and more investors are kind of chasing yields in the secondary markets, where in some cases there's less competition, or had been less competition, and less development, but that's kind of turning the corner as there's been a lot more recent interest among investors and developers in the secondary markets, which has put obviously some downward pressure on those occupancy rates, and we're still pretty close together there. I'll point out some interesting things on this slide. This slide shows a comparison of occupancy rates among the NIC MAP 31 seniors housing markets. These are the 31 primary markets. The blue circle shows the current occupancy rate. The orange circle shows the year-ago occupancy rate. The top of the blue bar shows the all-time high in the time series, and the bottom is the all-time low. So that's the spread. And for perspective, the green bar in the middle is the NIC MAP 31 market aggregate. And as I mentioned before, that's the occupancy rate there is 87.8%. Interestingly, 13 markets out of the 31 were higher than the primary market average. 13 were lower, and 5 were unchanged. Yes.
What about the Jacksonville market? Did you peek at that before you came?
I did, and I will show you a whole bunch of information about the Florida markets after this section. But these markets here, that's considered a secondary market, and it's in the top 99. These markets here, starting on the left, is the market with the highest second quarter occupancy, and that's San Jose at 95.7%. That's the top of its range. And it's up slightly from a year ago. After San Jose, the highest occupancy levels are in Portland, San Francisco, and Pittsburgh. And all of these markets have occupancy rates were 91% or above. And these are on average, average market, or average occupancy rates. On the other end of the spectrum is Houston. And that had an occupancy rate of 81.1%. And that was followed by Las Vegas, San Antonio, Atlanta, Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, and Dallas, all pretty low, with occupancy rates out of below 85%. So the most year-over-year improvement was seen in San Antonio, which improved by about 4.5 percentage points. And the most deterioration was seen in Los Angeles, which dropped about a little over 2 percentage points. So the key takeaway from this chart is that there's a pretty wide disparity between the best performing markets and the poorest performing markets. In fact, there's a 15 percentage point spread between the top and the bottom, which gives us, you know, a good indication that, you know, just like the old adage in real estate, it's all about location, location, location. And, you know, if you're only looking at the markets, you know, on the far left, you're going to have a very different perspective than what's going on with the markets on the right. So another thing to note is that out of the 31 primary markets, last quarter, 17 had occupancy rates that were lower than a year ago. and this quarter only 13 or lower, so there's some indication that things are improving. Now looking at the highlighted markets there, in the primary markets, we have Tampa, Orlando, and Miami. Tampa ranks 17th out of 31 with an occupancy rate of 87.9, which was 10 basis points, just very slightly lower than the primary market average. But Orlando ranked 19th and Miami ranked 21st and are slightly lower than the primary market average at 86.8 and 86.2%. And we'll get a little bit more into how those markets compare in Florida a little bit later. So this is a heat map, kind of a map of seniors housing inventory growth since the second quarter of 16, like 3 years ago. It shows the area of the country that has seen the most change in seniors housing inventory. The size of the circle represents kind of the absolute growth in unit counts, and the color of the circle represents inventory growth as a percentage of supply. And if we look at this map closely, we can take a look at what's going on in certain regions. Certainly the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast are seeing a lot of development, as is the major markets in the upper Midwest, Chicago, Minneapolis. Certainly we're seeing a lot of development in Texas, where there are low barriers to entry and a lot of development going on. It has been sustained for a long period of time. And certainly also in Florida, it's pretty much covered there. A lot of development. Atlanta is another huge one. But there's less development that you see out there in California. There is development going on, but it's not as great, primarily because those markets are really high barrier to entry markets where land can be scarce, entitlements and regulations. Entitlements can be hard to get for the highest and best use for that land. So, just to kind of summarize, the most inventory growth in unit count, again, the size of the circles was in Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, Minneapolis, Phoenix, and New York City. More than a quarter of the country's inventory growth in the past 3 years occurred in these 6 markets. The most inventory growth as a percentage of supply, which is shown by the deeper colors, was found in Charleston, which had 40%, Austin at 31%, and Fort Myers, Florida at 29%. This slide is showing seniors housing construction at the end of 2005 to the present quarter for the primary markets. The gray shaded area is looking at the actual number of spaces under construction, and the red line is showing the percent of inventory growth it represents. As of the second quarter, construction as a share of inventory represented 6.9% of the total inventory in the markets, and that's down from a peak of 7.7% that was reached at the end of 2017. This downward trend that we see is potentially good news for operators. It reflects the slow pullback in construction that developers are doing as they're feeling kind of the pinch of labor costs, the pinch of construction costs, constraints in tighter lending standards. And as I mentioned, this should be really encouraging to operators who have been impacted by the high levels of competition that have eroded occupancy rates in some markets. So it's potentially good news if this trend holds. Breaking down the seniors housing spaces under construction into the 2 component pieces. As of the second quarter, the primary markets, looking at the top chart, independent living, saw a little over 20,000 independent living units under construction, which represented 6% of the existing inventory, which is slightly lower than the all-time high number of spaces that were reached in the prior quarter. Still a slight upward trend with regard to independent living, but there's been a little dip down from the all-time high. Now, assisted living, after a steeper and longer construction cycle, is finally trended downward from its all-time high, and it's driving a lot of what we saw in the previous slide for seniors housing. It reached peak in the fourth quarter of 17, when inventory was 10%, And, currently in the second quarter, it's dropped down to 7.8%. Still a lot of construction, still high levels of construction, but, the good part is that it's abating a little bit. This slide is showing the construction starts for both independent living and assisted living since 2006 for the primary markets. And the key takeaway here is a slowdown that we see in the fourth quarter moving some of starts for assisted living. And that's what's driving much of the slowdown that we're seeing in construction. The second quarter saw the fewest assisted living starts since the first quarter of 14. And as a share of inventory, this amounted to 3.5%, which is much lower than the 6.5% that was reached at the end of 2017, or the end of 2015. And again, all of this may look encouraging. For those of us who've been concerned about the construction cycle that we're in, but it's important to note, just a caveat with regard to this data, this is construction starts data, and sometimes it gets revised upward and downward based on the reports from developers. Some may say they've broken ground, and we find out they haven't. So every so often there's some adjustments in these numbers. But the main point I want to make here is take a look at the shape of the lines, and I think pretty clearly that we can see that there's a slowdown in construction, and starts are also slowing down. So potentially we could see some increasing occupancy rates going forward. This is good news. And finally, to round out the macro market trends, I just want to show you kind of the highest and lowest markets for rent growth. Just like there's wide variation in occupancy rates across markets, there is a lot of variation in rent growth across markets as well. And among the primary markets, if we look at the left-hand side of the chart, the top ranked metro areas for year-over-year same-store rent growth were San Jose, which had the highest occupancy rate that we saw previously. That clocked in at 5.4%. Phoenix was 5%, and Las Vegas was 4.3%. The weakest growth, as we see by the highlighted areas that were happening in Florida, was in Orlando at 0.2% growth, and Miami at 1.7% growth. Now, look at the markets on the left. Obviously some of these, certainly the California markets are high barrier to entry markets. Some of these had high occupation rates, which really allowed rent growth to grow and be sustained in a lot of cases. However, kind of on the flip side, on the other hand of the side of the chart, some of these markets are pretty low barrier to entry markets, Atlanta being one of those, Dallas being one of those for sure. And some of these markets saw occupancy rates deteriorating, and thus there was less power among owners and operators to maintain rent growth. So just to kind of summarize this overview of the metro market before we switch gears, assisted living occupancy is at an all-time low of 85.1% due to the supply and demand imbalances. Inventory growth has been strong, absorption's been strong, but it just hasn't been strong enough to counterbalance all the development that's occurred in recent years. High levels of construction are starting to abate, which is good news. Should likely stabilize occupancy rates, perhaps even pop them up a little bit, depending on where we go. And in some markets, we're already seeing some improvements. So the macro trends tend to give us a broad understanding, but it's important to note that the data varies by market, and it's very important to look at the market level. So with that, I'm going to take a deeper dive into the Florida markets. Before I move into that, does anybody have any questions about the macro market trends? Yes?
Just a quick question. How do you define a secondary market? By house tops?
The way NIC defines markets, it's based on metropolitan statistical area. And so the largest MSAs go into the top 31 markets, and then the secondary markets are the next in line in size, going from 32 to 99. Florida, we'll see, has both primary and secondary markets. It also has what we call additional markets, which, for the most part, are, smaller markets, not necessarily markets that, are, incrementally smaller than the secondary markets, but, some markets that investors and developers, have wanted us to include, so.
Have you,
Yeah.
have they looked at any of the data on the rural counties? I know in Florida, there's roughly 32 rural counties. Approximately 1.2 million people live in those counties. And of course, demographically, they're aging at a exponentially faster rate, and they're not gonna leave. So, have you guys looked at any of that data nationally, or I guess, and for a lot of those big metro areas, those rural counties surround those, has any of that data folded into your analysis?
The data that I've shown is really, not that granular, but we do have the ability to go down to the county level. If you have the ability to access some of the NIC map reports, like the metro market report, they do show submarkets and do have, some of the breakdowns in construction, units, actually inventory, who actually resides in, or, the properties that actually exist in those markets as well. So, this data doesn't show down to that level, but we certainly have the capability to get down to that level. Yes?
Were the dips in occupancy almost anticipated a bit, given that the average age of entry into ILAO falls into the 1930s, which I think is like the lowest birth rate in the last century?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna show you a little bit later, a pretty interesting chart on the demographics, and a lot of operators did expect that, but, a lot of developers, I have to say, maybe jumped the gun a little bit with the development process, thinking that, we've been hearing, if you've been in the industry for a while, we've been hearing the baby boomers are coming, they're coming, what are we gonna do? We have to plan for them and make sure that there's enough product, and, in some instances, developers were overly exuberant about when this cohort was gonna hit. The good news is that we have gone through that dip, as you described, in demographics, so hopefully, we're starting to see, as absorption rates are becoming stronger, maybe we're seeing some of that play out, and occupancy rates should start to rise, if the supply and demand imbalances start to equalize a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about Florida. This slide is similar to what I showed you with the top 31 markets that NIC map tracks. These are the 15 markets that NIC tracks in Florida. Some of these, like I said, a few of these, there's a smattering of whether or not they're in the primary, secondary, or tertiary markets. Again, the blue circle is showing the current occupancy rate. The orange dot is showing the year-ago occupancy rate. And then the spread of the blue bars is the top and bottom of the range. And this dates back to the first quarter of 15. So out of the 15 markets, 10 had occupancy that was up from a year ago, and 5 had occupancy that was down from a year ago. Sebring, on the far left of the chart, has the highest occupancy rate of 92.3%.
In terms of these markets, how big is the Sebring considered for Sebring? And what I mean by that is, like, Sebring has the outlying cities, but they're not really metros because it's not that big itself. How big is the Sebring market?
I can't tell you the exact population for that.
I'm sorry, like it's mapped. Is the surrounding like Placid considered part of Sebring? That's the question. Do you know that?
I don't have that information on me, but I can really quickly and easily figure out what that metro area.
Most of those areas consider themselves part of Sebring, and that's why I was wondering how accurate that is.
Yeah, it's very possible that some of those areas that butt up to the city are included in that MSA. But certainly, if you catch me later, I can show you exactly what it is. Fort Myers, on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum has the lowest occupancy rate out of the 15 at 80.8%. And it had also the largest year-over-year drop of almost 2.5 percentage points. The villages and Punta Gorda have the widest average ranges for the time series at 25% and 23% respectively. And the villages, interesting, also had the largest increase in year-over-year occupancy, which is about 7 percentage points.
So the blue shows the range. The two dots show us this year and then a year ago.
Right.
So Jacksonville really hasn't moved.
Jacksonville improved a very small amount. And there's a few reasons for that. Certainly didn't go down, but it's not, it didn't increase very much over its year-ago rate.
Why?
I think there's probably a number of reasons, including the fact that there's been an extended period of construction. There's been slightly more absorption than inventory growth in the second quarter. So I'll show you a chart, a couple more ahead that will help shed some more light on what's going on in all of these markets. The map. This map, Florida is similar to the one we saw, heat map for the entire country, and it's showing annual inventory growth for the period of 3 years, second quarter 16 and second quarter 19. Out of these 15 markets in these 3 years, about 10,000 new seniors housing units, including IL, AL, and memory care, were added to these 15 markets.
Does this include census from the state growth? So like they increased so if a building had 100 units and they increased their license capacity to 150, is that included in this thing?
It wouldn't, it's purely new units. Did I answer the question? No. Okay. So the markets with the most inventory growth, which is the size of the circles, so far were Fort Myers at about 1,750 units, Miami about 1,650, Jacksonville at 1,200, Orlando at about 1,100, and rounding it out is Tampa at about 1,000. But these 5 markets comprised more than 2/3 or about 2/3 of the total inventory growth in the past 3 years, and Fort Myers itself comprised 17% of that inventory. The markets with the most inventory growth is a percentage of supply, which is shown by the more concentrated color of the circles. In other words, a lot of brand new shiny competition. For Fort Myers, as I mentioned before, the national level, 29%. Port St. Lucie, about 21%. The villages, about 18%, and Jacksonville rounded that out at 17.6%. So a lot of new construction as a share of inventory, really concentrated amount of competition in these areas. Next, I want to show you kind of a cool chart. I was really excited when my data team was able to pull this together for you guys. This is kind of a heat chart of construction as a percent of inventory in the 15 markets in Florida. And these are sorted in alphabetical order. And the scale ranges from 0, which is the darkest blue shades, to 30%, which is the deepest reds. And each square represents a quarter going back to the first quarter of 15. I think this chart's really cool because it's really helpful for understanding the varied construction cycle across the Florida markets for each individual market. So looking down and across the chart, you can see which markets have significant construction still underway and ones that are dormant right now. So looking at the red squares, Fort Myers, Jacksonville, Naples, Miami, and Orlando, and to some extent Sarasota, have been active in construction. They have an active cycle. since the beginning of 2015. However, looking at more the blue colors, Daytona Beach, Lakeland, Punta Gorda, Sebastian, Port St. Lucie, and the villages, which were active in prior quarters, as you can see, are now in a down cycle. As of the second quarter, looking at the squares at the far left-hand side of the chart, Sarasota, Jacksonville, Sebring, and Naples, including Fort Myers, Orlando, and Melbourne, and Miami, happen to be the most active, and Lakeland, Port St. Lucie, Punta Gorda, Sebastian, and the villages are the least active currently.
Will it build, if they're building community A, we'll call it, will it hit multiple squares, or is that as a start or as a completion?
It's construction as a share of inventory. So one building could take.
If it takes 6 months, it'll hit 2 quarters, basically.
Yeah, but the point is that you know, the darker it gets, you see that there's more competition and more building in one particular place as a share of inventory. Jacksonville, third one down, a lot of sustained construction, just sustained construction over time. Whereas Fort Myers was a lot more concentrated in the 2015 to 2017 range. You know, and a lot of what we see here mirrors what we saw in the rest of the country, where assisted living has been one of the main drivers of construction in these areas. I'm going to touch quickly on the supply and demand characteristics in the second quarter. In relation to the construction data I just showed, it's really going to provide a little bit more insight into the current occupancy rates by market. The largest quarterly supply and demand imbalance here is noted for Fort Myers, and that's on the far right-hand side, left-hand side of the chart, where annual inventory growth there was 7%, just in the second quarter, year over year, whereas annual absorption was just 3.9%. And that really helps explain why the average occupancy rate for Fort Myers happens to be so low at 80.9% or 80.1%. Jacksonville, Orlando, Naples, and Tampa each had slightly higher annual absorption than annual inventory growth, and their occupancy rates rose, although some of it may have risen smaller than others on a year-over-year basis, but they did rise. And the villages, Sebring, Sebastian, Lakeland, and Melbourne all saw large increases due to low inventory growth and high absorption rates. Does anybody have any questions or comments about this?
So in Florida, you have projects that are, you know, opening up, not meeting their pro formas, then they're going on the market as distressed, and that's then, you know, in terms of how the new owner reconfigures the license number of beds or the capacity or how they choose to reformat the business model. Does that fold into your analysis when you guys start looking at it? Because, and then obviously you have ACA, you know, who's going to terminate licenses, and there's other things that are affecting capacity overall.
Yeah, and we can see that actually right here. You know, some of the areas where we see negative inventory growth, there are properties that are shifting units from one level of care to another. In some cases, properties are being taken offline. I can't say that that's the case in these markets, but you know, a lot of what we see with negative inventory growth is because of some movement of properties from one level of care to another, moving of units. All right, I want to round out this part of the discussion and just take a look at same-store asking rent growth in the second quarter. We saw back in the metro market, or the large primary market trends, that Orlando and Miami are among those with the lowest growth. We see that here as well. Some factors with regard to why they might be lower in rent growth include, perhaps the age of stock. Are these markets, some of these markets that haven't been able to grow rent, do they have older stock? Are they perhaps more in need of refurbishment or repositionings? That's a question that needs to be answered. Another question is, what are the demographics? Has it been shrinking or improving? That plays a part in whether or not properties are able to grow rents, the labor market, the economy, where are the adult children, all of these things. Certainly home values have an effect as well. Naples is one of those markets that has seen a tremendous amount of price increase over the national average. Price increases for homes in Naples is pretty high. Whereas Fort Myers is one of those that has a lower rate of price increase compared to the national levels. On the flip side here, Lakeland and Naples lead the pack with the strongest rent growth. Lakeland's second quarter year-over-year rent growth is 5.1%, and Naples is 4.7%. For perspective, nationally, the average rent growth is 3%, so those are doing quite well with regard to rent growth. And, I can give you an explanation of, kind of what might be going on with Lakeland, just as an example of rent growth. Certainly, kind of that middle chart there, construction versus inventory, kind of nil with regard to Lakeland, and annual inventory growth is in negative numbers there. If we look at the top top left-hand chart, which is the occupancy rate, we see Lakeland having occupancy that kind of slightly trends upward. Where I've got the boxes there is that time frame and time series that we've been looking at. We see that there's been almost no new construction, which has allowed those units that were recently added to be absorbed in the market, which, as you can see, as a result, allowed rents to grow at a pretty good pace there. So those are some reasons, if you're looking at the market fundamentals, as to why either occupancy rates have grown or rent growth has occurred. So the remaining time I have, does anybody have any more questions about the Florida markets?
So is, with about, I don't know, I think we got what, 600,000-700,000 a year coming to Florida, most of which are over 60. Is that, is the projection that that's going to skew the demand and the increased demand for senior housing in the near term, next 3 to 5 years, or?
Well, certainly that will have an impact, and hopefully it'll allow a lot of the construction that's occurred, that we saw from that heat map, to at least start to be absorbed more. So increased demographics will certainly help with absorption and occupancy rates and rent growth. So I think that's absolutely a factor going forward that is a positive for the state of Florida. It's, and the warm states, Florida being one of them, are really high for in-migration of seniors, so that's also, another positive regarding demand in the state of Florida. So if we can kind of get construction starts to kind of slow down a little bit, give some time for this project to get absorbed, occupancy rates will start to rise. So that's a big question. So I'm gonna, for the last few minutes, kind of skip around a little bit. Wanted to leave you